Great to see you. I believe we're going on Facebook and YouTube. So great to see you there. And if you're with me on Facebook, I will be looking at what you have to say and responding as fast as I can. Great to see you for week 3, piece number 3 in this Bach on the Road project. Let me know who you are and where you're from if you can. And find ourselves today in Delhi, in India. We're working ever eastward. At a certain point, I imagine Bach may want to visit the large area of Russia and its surrounding countries, but so we may take a detour north. But so far, we've been going east and south in this road trip. Yes, happy Monday. Happy Monday to you too. This is a good way to spend it. I'm just going to make one last check and see that we're good. Excellent. Excellent. So, we've done the G minor sonata, the B minor partita, back to sonatas, and as you know by now, all 3 of these sonatas have the same form, as opposed to the partitas that vary in their form a little bit, even though they're all dance suites of some kind. Sonata, we've always got that slow first movement that we'll take the most detailed look at today. Then a fugue. We'll take a look at the fugue as well today too, so we'll get a look at both of those movements. And then the third movement varies. For this one, it's a beautiful movement with a baseline pulse that presents a lot of challenges, even though it's basically just a simple accompaniment figure on the bottom, melody on the top, and then a fast 16th note movement to end all 3 of the sonatas. So this first movement here is marked grave, and it's very similar to the first movement of the G minor. Let's give a listen to some of that. Good. We'll play some more later on. I got wrong-footed there for a moment, as they say in football, American soccer, football, and that's something we'll talk about too. Where do you want to shift? How do you want to navigate these long slurs? As with any of this music, we don't want people to necessarily see what's behind the curtain, right? That's supposed to be for us, the performer, and the more that we can help our listeners just hear the music, obviously it's going to be our take on the music, the more that we can help our listeners hear that and not so much the violin, the better. Although these are just great violin pieces anyway. Suzanne, thanks for saying you've looked forward to this all weekend too. I have to say I have too. I've been looking forward to playing this piece. Not that I didn't love the B minor, but every one of these I look forward to the next one. But I also try to enjoy where I am too, despite this being a road trip. So just like in the G minor, the G minor started with a 4-note chord. And we spent a fair amount of time a couple weeks ago talking about how to present that first chord, how to roll it. We have the same challenges here, except this one is a little tougher to play in tune. That one gave us 2 open strings. This one only gives us 1, and it's the open E string. Now it is probably true, well, it's definitely true that the open E string of the early instruments would have been a lot mellower than the open E strings we tend to use, even though on this instrument I play with 3 gut strings, albeit with metal winding. These are the Pure Astro Passion strings on the G, D, and A. I use, as pretty much every modern violinist does, a metal E string. This is a Hill E, the heavy gauge. Unless you're using some kind of gut E string, the open E can stand out, can even whistle, right? Sometimes I can just make it happen. There we go. And that's what we don't want for that first chord. So I'm inviting lightning bolts now, because I'm going to tell you how to make sure it doesn't whistle, and then the next time I play it, it's going to whistle. But here are ways. Let's talk about how to make it whistle. How did I just do that? Well, brief detour into arcane violin technique. If I want to make it whistle, I want a fast bow speed and light bow pressure. Yeah, those are the prerequisites. I'm probably going to play a little bit further away from the bridge as well. I'm going to be near the fingerboard, and I'm going to have a shallow angle of attack. So if you imagine a plane, landing on a runway, if that plane really touches down like that, that's not going to make the E string whistle. If it's a nice smooth gradual landing combined with that fast bow speed and light pressure, that's the recipe for whistling. So shallow angle of attack, light and fast. There we go. And once it starts whistling, it's not likely to stop unless I change course. So it can whistle that whole bow. So if I don't want it to whistle, I'm going to do the opposite of those things, right? I'm going to make sure that my angle of attack, if I'm coming from off the string, which I almost never do, if I were coming from off the string, I want to make sure that it was closer to vertical than horizontal. If I'm crossing from another string, that's what I'm doing here. If I just barely cross onto the E, that would be my shallow angle of attack. See, it'll whistle so easily. That time it didn't do it, but that's a shallow angle, and that is dangerous. So how do I not do a shallow angle? I cross all the way over to the E, or at least if I'm on the 2 strings, I make sure that the E is fully engaged. In other words, I have to be careful how gradually I'm going to roll this, because I'm inviting disaster if it's super gradual. And I want to make sure that I have enough weight into that E string that it doesn't whistle. Finally, the bow speed. Remember I said the faster it goes, the more likely it is to whistle. You did see it just whistle even with a slow bow speed here, but slow and focused with a full rotation over to the E. That should be my safest bet yet. There's yet one more thing you can help yourself out. You don't want to be at all crooked in this direction, in other words, with the hand away from the body. That is kind of like that in another axis, that's like a shallow angle of attack. Instead, if anything, you'd want to be a little bit crooked in this direction, or just straight. So follow the curve of the bridge, in other words. Now, why so much? E strings whistle sometimes, so why spend so much time on it? Mostly because it's the first note of the piece, and I've seen more than one person's confidence get rattled just because they start the thing, and it whistles. And so we want a ringing sound. We'd like it to be in tune, like to avoid the whistle, but there are other considerations, right? I could make sure it doesn't whistle by just playing really loud and really abruptly. Of course, that's not the character here. So I'm going to start with my normal 2 and 2. The bottom two are on octave, yeah? So usually what I like to do, I like to find my fourth finger first. Maybe I play something like that, and then I place the 1 over onto the G string. That's, for me, the most secure way to feel the octave. And the more practice you do with octaves, and in fact the more practice you do with the hand frame, meaning working with 1 and 4 down, so that could be straight octave practice, or it could be something like, or even 1 through 4 on the same string, The best example of this, the most classic, is the first etude of Rhythmic. Which, by the way, Heifetz did every single day of his violin life. And that's one of the many reasons why it strengthens that hand frame, makes it so that when you want to start this piece, again, I'm inviting lightning strikes, makes it so when you want to start this piece, you can be fairly confident of that octave. So I place my 4, my 1, okay? Basically 2 and 2, although I'm going to roll it a little gradually. Yeah. Little vibrato as usual. All right, that's enough on the first chord. But let me see if you have comments and questions about that. So a question already about the rhythm. And I notice my headphones are plugged in. I don't want to hear out of the headphones. Counting this in quarters or eighths or sixteenths or whatever. The smaller the note value that you count this in, the more accurate you may be able to imagine it or count it, right? When I was learning this, I probably felt every 16th note, right? Because we not only have 2 lines here for 16ths, we've got 3 for 32nds, we've got 4 lines for 64th notes. So the smaller the note value, the more accurate, the more divisions you have, so the easier it may be to count. But the more likely it is for the tempo to pull back and for this to be unbearably in 8 or even 16 when it's marked in 4. Why is it important to help the listeners hear it in 4? Because generally the chord changes happen every quarter note or even less often. Look at the bass line. You've heard me harp on the bass line all through this project so far. Where if I put those first 2 notes up the octave, that last one, the resolution, the E, is delayed. What we actually have on the beat is we get the E eventually, but it's just a little delayed. Let me play it now faster than I would perform it, just so that bass line is really easy to hear. Did you see lightning strike me? That wasn't even an open E. That was a 1 on the E, and it's still whistled. That's great. But it wasn't on the first chord. So the faster you play it, the easier it is to lead your listener from chord to chord through these bass lines. Of course, then there's hardly any time to make the quick notes beautiful. So whether you're talking about how you're going to count it or simply how fast you're going to play it, those are the main considerations you have to balance against each other. The ease of the harmonic progressions versus the beauty of everything in between. So at this point, I like to feel it in quarter notes. I can do that because I've gone through and done the math, in previous years about how everything divides up. Yes, and a good comment that the type of string you use can affect this too. I believe I mentioned this in one of the last couple weeks, but Varchal, Warchal, they do make an E string that cannot whistle. They've engineered it. It's got this weird little spiral in it before you stretch it out to put it on, and it won't whistle. I don't happen to love this general sound of it as much as I do this, but it won't whistle. So if that's your biggest concern, buy that string. So how to get over all the way to the G string. By the end of this chord, there shouldn't be that much weight on the bow. Therefore, I don't need to actually try to stop the bow and, make a big move filled with tension over to the G string. The bow should basically be stopped on its own. And then I can pivot over there. If I do it almost as part of the same bow, that to me is the simplest way to connect it. You can also play it on an up bow. Many people do that. To me, that motion from G to A on the up bow is less natural than simply G to A down to up. That's why I choose to do the extra down. How to finger the next thing, and as I mentioned, one of the decisions you're constantly having to make with these, in these long strings of notes, they're all through this music. When is it worth it to shift and stay on the string? When is it worth it to keep it simple in position and have more string crossings? I think most of us can agree, or even worse, is not going to be the best sound. You've got either an open E right away, or you've got one note on the E before you cross. So this, it seems pretty clear. It's nice to be on the A string. You could do 4-3, 1-1. You could do 4-4. If you do that, then keep the hand in first position. In fact, you may want to leave that 2 down on the string that you had, because then you come right back to it. I'm a big fan of leaving fingers down when I can. If you use that fingering, what you don't want is to do it gradually, right? There has to be a little decision in the fourth finger that it sounds still clean. Perhaps there's a puff of help from the bow. If you don't like that, then just shift to second position, up a half step. That's easier to get clean. Then you just have to worry about the 1 there. As with all the bass lines that I play, when I can, especially if it's that walking kind of bass line, as in here, I like to keep the lengths similar. The first note is written as a quarter. The second note is written as a 32nd. Nevertheless, that string is going to ring. I picked neither nor that time. So I'm coming off the bass notes a little. Here's a part, a lot of people who have the Galamian International Edition, which was the most popular one when I was growing up. A lot of people who have this may play with it for a while without noticing or understanding these square and circle symbols. What that means, he explains it in the beginning, but it's important, whether you like these fingerings or not, it's important to understand what he's after with those symbols, and for you to think along similar lines when you make your own fingerings. So the Bach's fingering is a reach followed by a shift. In other words, the finger reaches without the rest of the hand going along with it. Now the hand catches up. Here I am in bar 3. That was getting into bar 3. Beginning of bar 3, same thing if you're using his fingering. Reach back to 1. Now the hand follows to take us all the way down to first position. You can compare that to the end of bar 4, for example, where he's got a finger with a circle around it. That is a shift where the hand moves together. Here he's using it like that. And to actually get to another position. So again, whether you're using those particular fingerings, you should yourself know the difference, your hand should feel the difference between reaching and then shifting, or letting the whole hand move together. A lot of intonation problems happen when you haven't really decided. You kind of reach and move at the same time. And then what usually happens is the note that you're reaching for or the note right before gets compromised because the hand doesn't know exactly when to move. So it's good to be exact about that stuff. And Donald, you have a good question about the chords, the harmonic progression, the bass line. I've admitted many times during this project so far that I was a little bit unkempt in my studies, let's say, in harmony in school. I always thought I had more important things to do, practicing or, going out for lunch at the diner. And that's something I'm trying to remedy at this point. So I'm definitely not the last authority. And I myself have felt like I really don't know what the progression is here, what the change is. To be honest, the better understanding you do have, the richer your experience with the music and the more that you can convey that to the audience, but it's not a requirement. The changes in here are not all that complex. But for example, just knowing that sometimes the bass line moves around octaves, and so if a bass line doesn't make a lot of sense to you, you have to trust that it's Bach, so it should make sense. So you can play around moving the octaves. That was a big, when I learned that helped me a lot. Knowing that some bass notes are implied rather than played outright, because of the limits of the instrument or because Bach finds that more interesting, as with that E that we were talking about. But that, knowing that we're in A minor, A and E are the most important centers here, and so most of the time if you hear a D sharp, it's got to resolve somehow to an E. G sharps have to resolve to an A somewhere. So if you're looking for those, then you can play it in such a way to make your audience look for them too, and to make them enjoy the arrival. This is not, a really powerful arrival, of course, because it's just the very beginning of the piece, and it's even delayed. It's kind of implied. So knowing that, that's a nice reason for me to dim a little bit, to play that as a little bit more uncertain moment rather than, and to just kind of plow through there. Um, so again, there are very few wrong answers, but to the extent that that harmony can help you come up with a plan, it's just that much better. Let me start once more at the beginning to play through there. As I play, and I'm going to play a little bit more than I did before, notice how I will distribute the bow. We touched on this in the G minor sonata, but when I have a long bow of notes, what I'd like to avoid is having a totally even bow speed, a total even distribution, because that makes it very hard to shape. I would then have to rely just on pressure. You change the pressure too much, you change the contact point too much, you're going to change the type of sound. Like, see how it gets a harder edge to it? If instead I do it with bow distribution, then I can make a crescendo without changing the kind of sound. the whole movement. Obviously this one connects, doesn't it, to the next movement, because we started in A, we finished what should be an in tune E octave. That's got to resolve. So in performance, this would not be a great place to retune and wipe your, everything. Instead it goes on to an amazing fugue. We won't get there quite yet. This also has kind of a fake ending, doesn't it? And then a little tail, a PS, if you will. And many of the movements in this whole set have such an ending. And so it's not at all too obvious to play it that way, since that's the way it's written. You've made a big statement, and then here's a little coda connection to the next movement. Where did it really finish? Bar number is 21, midway through bar 21. So I chose to take a fair amount of time, even though that's just a 16th note. Literally, it's written. Yeah, so I milked it. Yeah. If I want to help listeners understand that that's still part of the same beat, I'm not going to put a big space there, and I'm certainly not going to articulate the next bow, right? If I want to give the illusion that it's all part of the same A chord, then I have to start the next bow where I leave off the down bow. And look at this. This is brilliant. The bass line starts the same as it did in the beginning of the movement. Remember, in the beginning of the movement we had... Here, listen to what happens. Still F. And finishing on E. I love the way that looks back at the beginning of the movement. So let me see what you have to say about all of that. One is just a question about strings and whether I have to change them more often than other kinds. In my experience so far, and I've been using these about 5 years on this violin, I find that I don't need to change them as often, especially if I'm comparing to something like dominant. Those I really felt like after a month, their best sound was kind of behind them. These I'll routinely go 3 months. Things might be different if I were playing solo every day of the week. Some orchestral players, it's like there's a joke that people use for their strings and for their concert clothes. They say, I change them once a year, whether it needs it or not. Now that's, hope we don't take that literally, but 3 months, and I often still find that I like the sounds of those. The E I'll do more often. That's not a passion. The E is probably every month. Now, Bill, you ask about trills and whether trill drilling can be helpful, beneficial. Absolutely. And by trill drill, Bill's referring to some videos that I made on working on trills. And the great thing about working on trills is they don't just help trills, they help all your playing, because it just strengthens that hand frame beautifully. So if you want to find that, that's on YouTube. It's a 3-parter, and I did make a couple of worksheets for that to help make it easier. I even made flashcards that you can print out, cut out if you're feeling crafty at home these days. Print them out, cut them out, put them in bowls or hats. Select your cards at random to make your own trill drill. That's why I made videos about it, because I love the drill. And yeah, you mentioned trilling on threes and fours. I don't do a lot of fourth finger trills. I drill with them because it helps my fourth finger in general. I'll do it if necessary. The other fingers are just usually going to be a little sprightlier, so I'll use them when I can. But sometimes it's to my advantage to trill on a fourth finger, not to have to shift around to avoid it. And Anita, you ask a great question about the three variables: speed, pressure, contact point. Another thing I have a guide for, you can Google that at Nate's Violin, 3 variables. And your question is about whether I like to just think about varying one of them and kind of separating the variables in that way so that I know what effect speed is having and pressure is having. I do like to do that, but in your follow-up question, you say, are they too intertwined to really do that? And you know, you're smart to ask that question. And for those who don't know, I know Anita knows, but those 3 variables are intertwined. When you change one, you've got to change the other 2 in corresponding ways to keep a pure sound. However, most of the time, you can do that without being too conscious of it. So like if I want to experiment with bow speed, you know, I could play that first note, or I could play it with a faster bow to start and then slowing down. That's what I'd like to do in performance. So let's say I want to experiment with that. I do it. Now I know, and my body knows, that to do that, to play with a faster bow, I have to move the contact point out, and therefore I also have to lighten, well, basically the big adjustment I make is I have to move it out. What happens if I don't? I go from this, slow bow. If I keep the contact point there, faster bow, immediate ponticello. If you're trying that at home, you probably wouldn't even try doing that because you could sense that it was going to be a bad sound. So rather than just scrapping the idea of the faster bow, just realize what you have to do to make that work. You've got to move it out away from the bridge. So if you're rusty on how those things interact, download that free guide. That'll be a big help. So Anita, I do like experimenting with one variable, and I try to let my body make the other adjustments automatically. And if it's not working, then I kind of go back to, well, the guide that I wrote. Look it up for reference, or just remember what those relationships are. They're mostly hardwired in the muscles now. A couple more questions before we take a little look at the fugue. Robert, you asked about playing fifths in tune, and let's see, you had a specific one. Well, you're talking about the very first chord, and that one's got a tough octave. Well, it does have a fifth, but not on adjacent strings, which I think is maybe what a lot of people would be wondering about. Let's see, the first good example of that we could come up with, bar 5, the downbeat of bar 5. Almost everything gets better with repetition, so you know, if you have never done a scale in fifths, maybe now's a good chance to try it. It can be frustrating, but it'll sure teach you where those fifths lie on the fingerboard. The thing to know is that you almost have to learn them for every single note and every single finger, because they're all going to feel different. And if you hand me a different violin, it's going to feel different on that one. There are some principles that you can, that hold in common, however. Generally, you want a little bit of a flatter finger, meaning, if you try playing fifths with a really upright finger, probably not going to work that well. You need some flesh there to cover the 2 strings. And then when you're correcting the pitch of a fifth, like let's say I put that down, it's 3-3. It's not ringing right. Well, rather, the first instinct is, or even worse, start worming it around. That's not going to help me because I'm not going to know how to place it for the next time. Instead, if I immediately know what's wrong, like in this case I can tell the A string note, the D is too low, then well, I know. But if I don't know, play the notes separately. It's surprising how many people aren't willing to do that because they don't want to hear an out of tune note. But you got to do it so you know which one is low. The A string note is low. Therefore, what I'm going to do, I'm going to pick up the finger and move more of it onto the A string. Put it back down. Well, now the fifth is in tune with itself. I've solved that balance problem. Both notes are a little too low, which I know because it's lower than the open G. But at least now I can just pick it up and move both of them higher. There we go. So I try to memorize that feel. Here's where the finger needs to land on the string. Now let me see if I can lift and place that again. Ah, there we go. You've got to do that almost for every separate fifth. So a scale in fifths is a good way to start looking at that. Good. Let's take a brief look at the fugue, and I'll get to more of your questions as well. Yeah, play the first little bit. And just as in the G minor fugue, we've got our subject, pretty simple subject. And we'd like our listeners to be able to hear that subject wherever it appears, in whichever voice it appears. I got most of the way through that and I thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if in the famous place that always sounds bad, I didn't sound bad? And then I got there and it's famous for a reason. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. I've got strategies there for myself and for you. Good. So the challenges here, they're most of the same challenges that are in the G minor fugue. This one's longer. The C major fugue is longer still. The chords in this one tend to be a little bit more awkward, and there are fewer stretches of this A minor fugue where you get some relief. In the G minor fugue, you had some more places of where you could more or less coast a little bit and just enjoy the progressions. There are fewer of those spots in this fugue relative to how much straight fugue stuff there is. Other than that, it's a lot of the same things. The more that you're comfortable finding the double stop string levels, the better. And so just as a reminder, we've got our 4 single string levels, in addition 3 double stop string levels. You also heard it whistle once in the fugue too, right? So really 7 different levels. And there's one place in here, namely bar 40, where many people will break or roll these the other way from top to bottom. As I've talked about many times in this series, I don't do that, but I understand why people do. So we'll look at that in a second as well. Now let me see what you have to say about this fugue. Good. And Daniel, since you ask, That was my 42nd birthday for our last Bach on the Road session. So that's the ripe old age. Well, here's Michael, I like specific questions. So you ask, back in the grave, in the sixth measure, there's this, and you ask whether that should be played as a harmonic. I think it's a very beautiful harmonic. What's one consideration when we're using harmonics? You have to listen to the notes on either side. If I vibrate the heck out of, then that's going to sound pretty strange. So in terms of sound quality and vibrato, since harmonics get no vibrato, I'd like to fit it into the line. A gentle sound. Very little vibrato the note before or after. After is a trill in this case, or I choose to play it as a trill. So if I do it in that way, then it could fit very nicely into the line. Saves me an extra string crossing. I won't go over all the general fugue stuff that we did for the G minor. You may have noticed that in this A minor fugue, I did some hooking. I kind of tried it out this time. I haven't usually done that. What I'm talking about is we've got a series starting in bar 18. So the interesting line is the bottom line, right? And then that switches to the top line. I say the interesting line, but with Bach there are no uninteresting lines. Let's look for a second at the counter subject. I'm interrupting myself, I know, with the hooking question, but I think we should lay this out first. Anytime you've got a fugue, you've got a first entrance, a second entrance. The thing that the accompanying voice does for the second entrance, so that's our little counter subject. So we've got this descending half step motive. And see, that keeps going. So in these little interludes, it's the descending half step. There are like 4 of them in a row. So instead of so back to the place we were talking about at 18. What have we got? And now when it switches, the top voice is the interesting one. What is the bottom voice doing? So that's obviously you want your listeners to be able to hear those in the right places, and to perhaps even to group or phrase as I'm doing that way. You know, I get new energy for each series rather than just one long da 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 da. I've got new energy. So when it switched voices, I thought I'd experiment, and now I see that it's suggested that way in the Galamian edition, but I really don't remember doing that before. But maybe I did. So I might decide to go back to separate bows, but I would change the sound somehow. When the interesting voice was the lower one, I was playing a little bit longer. But in this other register, I feel it a little shorter. And now just playing with the subject, right? So instead of just taking the first part of the subject and a little variation, accompaniment almost. Here, bar 40, here's a place where many people, because the bass line is so interesting, right? It's from the fugue subject. So some people for me, as you know, I put those bass notes on the beat and hope that the listeners' ears can reconstruct that. Now here's the famous place. So that second chord in bar 43, 2, 4, 3, 1, I almost always find it easiest to place the tritone first, meaning 4, 3, and then to put down the surrounding fingers. So 4 and 3 go first, and then 2, 1. That goes for most 3 and 4 note chords. I like finding that tritone because those are the fingers that need to be stuck together. So I have to give myself time, and that's what I didn't do in the playthrough for you. Stick the tritone. Yeah. Good. And it's fitting, isn't it, getting these whistles? Pretty good average for you guys, but let me see some last questions for you, because we're going to do the bulk of our work on the fugue next time on Wednesday. And Benjamin, as far as practicing for technical control, you know, one bit at a time. We'll get into some more specific strategies for this movement on Wednesday. Yeah, these fugues can be beastly. You want to be well up in your double stops. You know, I mentioned fifths. I don't practice scales in fifths every day, but I do practice scales in thirds every day. Practice octaves every day. It doesn't have to be a ton either. And, you know, maybe you do scales every day, but you only do the double stop scales every other day. That can be fine too. I think if you're building the foundation, it's nice to do it every day, even if it's just for a few minutes. But, you know, if you're not comfortable with thirds in general, it's going to be hard to be able to shape that the way you want. You're constantly going to be struggling to get thirds in tune. So that's the first thing, is building that scale routine, especially including double stops. And that's the best advice I can give. As for the bow actually I find less complicated. You know, you pick which strings you need to be on and make a beautiful sound on those strings. The pitch has so much to do with it. And Kathy, you ask how set am I with the bowings. If I were going to, you know, perform this in a recital, I myself would be pretty set. And as I think I mentioned with the G minor, if it were a situation where I knew I was going to perform this, you know, 7 times in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I bet that by the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th time, you know, I'd be trying a few new things out with the bowing. But if it were just getting ready for 1 performance or 2 performances, I'd pretty much want to know what I was going to do. I think it's easily possible to sound free and to be able to shape things in the moment without actually changing bowings in the moment. Some movements might lend themselves to that better than others. Fugues can be tricky if you start improvising bowings on the spot. I'll just throw that out there. And Joanna, you mentioned that in Flesh, I assume you mean the Flesh version of this Bach, the beginning, hooking 2 and 2. That's a fine idea if there's a progression there, natural. You can still shape it that way even if you do separate bows, right? A little bit lighter on the up bows, but I think it's a fine idea. I wouldn't adopt it as a general thing throughout the movement. For me, that would have a tendency to get a little fussy. The simplest for me is just as it comes. But I do hook. I do less hooking than some people, but I do think that's a fine idea. And then Lisa, you asked the difference between a sonata partita and a fugue. So a fugue would be, that could describe, well, in these 3 sonatas, it describes a movement. It's always the second movement of these sonatas. And that's a construction where you've got a simple subject, and that subject features throughout the movement. It's hidden, it could be reversed, could be played twice as fast or twice as slow, up the octave, down the octave. And it's a puzzle. It's a bit of a puzzle. A sonata, in this case, all 3 of these sonatas contain a fugue movement. So a sonata is a collection. It could have different definitions, but in terms of these solo violin pieces, they're each collections of 4 movements. A partita traditionally is a suite of movements for an instrument, usually maybe always, but usually a solo instrument, and they tend to feature dance movements, which so in this sonata, would be a little hard to dance to. You could maybe dance to the fugue. Great. I think I'm going to save other questions for next time. I'm going to get Miguel. That's a great question about the end of the grave. Let me get to that next time. Donald, a video on uppo staccato. I don't know. That's one of the few things that I don't have a great system to teach. And when I'm practicing it a lot on my own, it's there. Other times it's hit and miss. We're talking about, like that one had a little trouble getting off the ground, but a little scratchy, not as fast as I'd like. So I would hate to teach you with incomplete information. And yeah, I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly, but Jens Joachim, asking about vibrato, mentioning that in Germany, a large romantic vibrato is quite out of fashion in Bach. It's probably out of fashion in more places than just Germany, and it's my hope that the way I use vibrato in this music would be, a pared down version of what I would do in, romantic music. I don't want anything to distract. I don't want vibrato to distract, but I also don't want a lack of vibrato to distract. I think however you choose to express yourself, it has to come from from you, from how you hear the music, how you hear violin sound, and we'll talk about that more, especially in the 3rd movement of this great sonata. And we'll get a start on that next time. We'll talk mainly about the fugue and get a start on the 3rd movement on Wednesday here, same time, same channel. So thank you so much again for being here with me. Always great to see you. Great to spend this time with you and with Bach. So come back for Wednesday. Look forward to seeing you again. And tell your friends. Share this on Facebook if you wouldn't mind. And I'll see you very soon. Thanks.